All right, so Lincoln had won the election of 1860, goes into the presidency in March of 1861, and several southern states have seceded. The so-called middle ground states, the border states, are waiting to see what Lincoln and the Republicans are going to offer as a compromise. So there's a lot of feelings of anxiety and not really knowing what the future holds for both sides going into early March 1861. So in the months before, obviously, Buchanan is still president, and Buchanan had done really nothing to stop secession. He was a Southerner himself. He outwardly said that he didn't like secession. He declared it to be illegal against the Constitution. Says that the southern states have the right to revolt if they want to try to overthrow the U.S. government, but not to simply just walk away through secession. And then Buchanan goes forth and does absolutely nothing to stop them. So he issued statements. Don't do this, you're not allowed to do this, but didn't take any actual real action to stop the southern states from really doing it in the real world. Lincoln and the Republicans stick to their campaign ideas and what had basically become one of the big party kind of mantras, that they didn't want to get rid of slavery in the southern states, most of them. They just wanted to make sure it didn't spread into the territories. Lincoln appoints also his major rivals in the Republican Party into his cabinet. So the guys he ran for president against for the Republican nomination, he makes especially Seward into Secretary of State, Stanton into Secretary of War, Chase into Secretary of the Treasury, and these were all leading Republican figures and people who were more famous in Republican circles than Lincoln was going into 1860. So he takes a lot of the kind of more extremists that he defeated in the nominating process and puts them into his cabinet. So the cabinet has very strong personalities that very often overshadow Lincoln and try to push Lincoln around. But Lincoln obviously has the final say and drives them crazy when he doesn't agree with them in a lot of ways, which is well represented in the new movie that came out on Lincoln a few weeks ago. There's been several books written on the topic of his cabinet, and he had to fire some of them eventually because he couldn't put up with their complaining, and they're accusing him of basically destroying the United States through his own inaction. Basically, he wasn't moving fast enough for them. But their demand is still they're willing to allow slavery to exist in the states where it already is legal. They just don't want to see it spread into the territories. Lincoln, in his first days after being inaugurated, and in his inauguration address, he makes that very clear, that he doesn't want to remove slavery from the South, just wants to stop it in the territories. The day after his inauguration, he is met with a crisis. There are U.S. Army contingents spread throughout the South. Most of them put down their U.S. Army uniforms and picked up what they start calling the Confederate States of America uniforms. So this new Southern government started taking over federal property. U.S. Army pieces, armories, forts, post offices, all kinds of federal government property now changes hands in the South. And now it's an outrage to the North. A lot of Northerners said that that alone is an act of war. Lincoln didn't want to start fighting just over something like that. Some of the troops that are loyal to the United States in South Carolina choose to leave the mainland and really center themselves on an island just off of Charleston Harbor, a small island that is basically a fortress that was built in the entryway into the harbor. So Fort Sumter, if you put enough cannons and stuff on it, you can shoot at any boats trying to get into the major city. So Fort Sumter is a strategic point, especially to the south, because Charleston is one of their biggest export places, along with New Orleans, one of their biggest cities in general. So the Southerners, the Confederate forces, surround Fort Sumter on land. So the Southern forces largely start occupying the coastline. They start bringing cannon to the coastline, and they threaten Fort Sumter with attack unless Union troops give in and surrender. Fort Sumter's commander the Union commander, the U.S. commander of the fort, sends a letter to Washington, D.C. addressed to the president, and it reaches Lincoln the day after his inauguration. And Lincoln's decision is pretty big with Fort Sumter. He has really three different lines of policy that he can take. Number one, he can send more U.S. military contingents, a bigger chunk of the U.S. Army, to the fort to try to defend it, because it is, again, federal property. But that takes the risk of launching an attack against the South. Lincoln doesn't want to do that. Lincoln's policy is that if a war starts, he wants to be able to blame the South for starting it. So he also doesn't want to just let the Southerners just take over the fort, because that would make Lincoln look weak. So he chooses a middle ground, which is basically to send some boats with supplies, food, medicine, and whatnot, to go to the fort to resupply the fort. The Southerners see this happening and realize that he's not going to give in, so they launch their attack, and therefore Lincoln can blame the South for starting the war. The attack starts about a month later. Starts somewhere around 3 a.m. or so this morning in April, where the Southern cannon just basically open up on the fort, and they just bombard the fort for about a day and a half. The fort was literally just a sitting duck and just took a massive bombardment for quite a while. So several Union troops are killed in this stuff, and it's very clear that the fort is not going to be able to hold out for very long. They in fact surrender on the second day. So the Southerners win the first kind of official so-called battle. It wasn't much of a battle because the guys in the fort didn't shoot back very much. They just kind of ducked and covered for their lives. But that's the official first shooting of the Civil War. So in that way, Lincoln loses control. The North loses control over a fort they would probably militarily never have been able to hold against the surrounding Southern forces. And they're also able to blame the South for starting the actual shooting. Once Sumter was attacked, Lincoln puts out a call for something like 75,000 volunteer soldiers from the North to defend federal property throughout the country. Lincoln, again, does not call this a war, and he does not call it a war very often. He calls it a rebellion, because that's where his power comes from as president. He gets to do a lot of things as president that are usually unconstitutional because he is calling this a rebellion. The Southern government from Richmond puts out a call to the South for 100,000 Southern military volunteers to defend what they view as their own independent country now. They write their own constitution, which is almost an exact Xerox copy of the U.S. Constitution, with one important difference. Anyone want to take a guess at the difference?
Slavery.
Slavery forever. And the Confederacy is largely just a confederacy. It's like what the U.S. had in the 1780s. Just a whole bunch of states that are individual little states that are just informally bound together and are supposed to support each other. So you're going to get the U.S. government in the North fighting against what comes to be known as the Confederate States of America, or the CSA, or the Confederacy, or however you want to term it. And again, after Fort Sumter falls, or after the attack really begins, some of the other southern states, Arkansas, Tennessee, Virginia, North Carolina, vote to join the South. And the southern capital is relocated to Richmond, Virginia. Virginia is a very interesting case. When they took their vote in the Virginia state legislature to secede, the furthest west counties in Virginia voted against it, almost unanimously. So you even get a split within the state of Virginia about which side to join. And eventually a new state is carved out of that, which becomes known as West Virginia. So you have, in this instance, a group of counties seceding from a state because that state had chosen to secede from the United States. And that sets up a very interesting problem for Lincoln. Lincoln took a stand against secession. But in this instance, he's benefiting from this secession, right? Because this is a part of a state that wants to stay loyal to the United States. So what does Lincoln do? He quickly moves to allow that to become an official U.S. state. So his views on secession depend on the circumstances. What he stands to gain, what he stands to lose as a result. And he largely prevents the rest of the border states from seceding by sending in the military and arresting people and throwing them in jail. Separate them so they can't have a vote. And those are the eventual kind of dividing battle lines between North and South in the Civil War. Okay, so questions about that at all? All right, a whole lot of the time we talk about the Civil War, I like to focus on the battlefield and who's winning what battles in any given moment, any given year. Because I think that is fundamentally important to understand if you want to go on and study the Civil War further, understand the political debates, the results of elections, possible negotiations to end the war. All that stuff is the result of who's winning on the battlefield. All the political kind of weight, the repercussions of all this stuff hinge on who looks most likely to win the war at any given point. And for a long time it looked like the South was going to win for the first few years. So I like to do the military focus and try to bring in some more of the political kind of debates that are ongoing. But that's my view of the war, especially if we're going to try to do this whole thing in like 2 days, which is insane and ridiculous. If you ever take a university history class, you'll take like a whole semester on the Civil War and study it in huge depth, which we're basically going to gloss over the highlights. Okay, in order to understand the battlefield progress of the Civil War and the internal debates, especially in the North, you have to understand what the armies look like, who's in charge, what the strengths and weaknesses are of each army. And especially what the military goals for each side are. The goals for the North, the United States side, are fairly simple. To stop the South from leaving and to bring them back in. So the call in the North is to preserve the Union. And the call for the soldiers who volunteer to fight, they say that they're all for the Union. They say they're defending the Constitution, they are defending democracy. There is not much talk about freeing slaves. There is talk, say, amongst the House of Representatives and certain politicians and newspapers and whatnot. But the overwhelming feeling of the northern population was that this war is not going to be fought to free slaves at first. They are fighting to preserve the Constitution, preserve the United States as it had existed up until then. That changes in late 1862. So about a year and a half in when Lincoln gives the Emancipation Proclamation. And we'll talk about that more in detail. But so by late 1862, the beginning of 63, Lincoln personally adds the freedom for slaves, the idea of expanding freedom and liberty to a giant class of people who were previously oppressed, obviously. So those are the two major war goals for the North. The Southern goals, the Confederate state goals, are to keep their independence. They had basically issued declarations of independence. They had written their own constitution. They viewed themselves as their own country. And they viewed themselves as the literal inheritors of the American Revolution. They viewed the North as a tyranny, as these northern politicians coming in to try to eradicate slavery. So they viewed themselves as being pushed around by northern politicians that are dominant. And so they said that the only way to escape from this kind of cultural colonization is to separate themselves and start a new country. So they literally talk about themselves as the new revolutionaries. And they talk about this as the Second American Revolution. So their number one goal, just like the original American Revolution, is to keep independence by really any means necessary. In order to do that, they feel that they're going to have to get recognition from European countries. Mostly Britain and France. The same two countries are obviously heavily involved in the First American Revolution. So the Southerners will send diplomats to Britain and France very quickly in order to at least get recognition from those countries. Foreign recognition, which could bring foreign aid, could bring money, could bring supplies, could even bring foreign intervention. The British and French armies could intervene in this just like they had in the First Revolution. And Lincoln and the Northern government is desperate to stop that. Does anyone know how Lincoln and his leaders forced Europe to not recognize the South, which is eventually successful? The Europeans never recognized the Southern government. What could Lincoln threat to do to Britain or France if they intervened? Yeah, to attack. Lincoln and his cabinet threatened to go to war against Britain, France, and the South all at the same time if Britain and France, or France, attempted to intervene. So once we get to the battles, you'll understand the United States, the Northern government, has enough trouble fighting the South. So this threat of fighting two other very powerful countries, two of the most powerful countries at that point, it's a stretch. But that got the British and the French to really back down. So eventually the recognition project fails for the South. So another one of their goals is to make the war so expensive in money and blood for the Northern population that the Northerners would just eventually give up. The exact same strategy that George Washington used against the British. Just simply survive. Keep fighting until the enemy gives up. So questions about that at all? Does all that make sense? What kind of strategies do they have to actually accomplish their different war goals? The tactical battles for the North are far more daunting. In order to achieve their goals, bring the South back into the Union, they will have to invade the South and occupy the South and convince the Southerners somehow to give up their independence, their new country. So the U.S. war goal is much, much larger, much more difficult than the Southerners' war goal. But the United States also had far more resources to use in the war. It will take them a couple years to really ramp up their war production, to turn those factories into war machines to make guns and bullets and cannons and all the stuff that you need to fight wars with, to supply armies. But the Northern population is far larger than the South. They have almost all the major cities. They have almost all the factories. They have almost all the railroad lines to move goods and men around quickly. That is how the United States had developed over about the past 30 to 40 years, going back to the 1820s. Their population is larger, therefore they can get more soldiers, and the Northern armies will always have more soldiers than the Southern armies. The North has far more factories, so they can make more stuff, to the point where a lot of the Southern soldiers eventually go barefoot, even when they're fighting. And the Northern armies will move faster, because they often have railroads to move them around, to move their men and their materials. The major advantage that the Southerners had is that the major military academy, West Point, the college that trained officers in how to fight, is located in Virginia. So a lot of those officers are from Virginia. Virginia goes to the South. So the South, by default, gets almost all of the best military minds in the United States at that point. So the South, by default, gets basically the best generals, the best trained military officers. And their goal is much easier: to simply avoid defeat, to not lose. They will fight a largely defensive war, almost entirely for the entire war. And almost all of their victories on the battlefield will be defensive victories. So the Southern strategy is defensive. Just defend your territory against the Northern invasion, which means that they can pick out the best places to fight and just wait for the Northern army to move into their area. And really the two instances where the Southerners try to launch invasions into the North are both pretty disastrous. But for the first few years, it is almost always the Northern armies attacking, especially into Virginia. The North had basically three different targets, or two different giant targets that they want to use to end the war. The first one is called the On to Richmond strategy, which is literally build up a gigantic army around Washington, D.C. You can see up there in the Northeast, in Maryland, right on the border of Maryland and Virginia, and simply invade and conquer Richmond, the southern capital. If you take the capital, you can end the war. That's the theory. So a huge amount of the fighting will occur between Washington, D.C. and Richmond, over and over again, year in and year out. A secondary northern goal is to use the U.S. Navy and line them up around the southern coastline, all the way from the Atlantic into the Gulf of Mexico, and form a blockade to basically strangle the southern economy into surrender, so that the Southerners cannot trade with Europe or anywhere else in the world, and European goods cannot make it in. In order to complete that, the U.S. Navy will launch attacks against New Orleans to try to conquer the Mississippi River. And then they will launch attacks from the north down the Mississippi River, because they figure if they conquer the river, they can cut the western states, the western southern states, Arkansas, Louisiana, Texas, cut them off and just tighten the noose around the southern economy that much harsher. So those are the two major military strategies that the North will use to eventually win the war, obviously. The southern strategy is defensive. Stop that from happening. And when they see a good opportunity at some point to invade the North and possibly end the war in the next few weeks, they'll try to take it. So does that make sense? The Northerners also evolve an idea that they call total war, which will eventually mean you don't just attack one army at one time, you attack all Southern armies all at the same time, so they can't move around and help each other. And also you attack the Southern population. You don't just attack soldiers. You destroy cities, you destroy farms, you destroy everything in the South to convince the Southerners to give up as fast as possible. So any questions about any of this stuff? Are you alive? Sort of. Okay. All right. The blockade strategy was known as the snake strategy or the anaconda strategy. It has a lot of different terms. It was developed by the head general of the U.S. armies going all the way back into the 1840s, the War with Mexico, Winfield Scott. So it was called Scott Snake, or there's a lot of different names for it, but it's the naval blockade. And there's a few problems inherent in Southern strategy, especially if you're fighting a defensive war. That could take a long time to convince the North to give up, right? The more time you give the North, the more time you give their Navy to implement the blockade, and the more time you give their factories to churn out more guns and bullets and cannons and all that kind of stuff. So the Southern strategy, in the long term, has that flaw built into it. The more time you give the North, the more disadvantaged you become if you're the South. And their strategy was basically wait them out. Okay, so the armies start to be built in the spring, the very early spring of 1861. We're going to go through also different leaders of the armies, but we'll get to that in a few minutes. The original leader of the Northern Army built around Washington, D.C., called the Army of the Potomac, is named McDowell. There is a lot of optimism in the United States and the South that the war won't take very long. It's just going to take a few battles because, people that are literal family members and brothers don't want to fight each other for very long. So there's a feeling in 1861 that it's just going to take one or two maybe big battles somewhere around Washington, D.C., then one side or the other is going to give up and you're going to have a result. So when the original recruits signed up, especially in the North, they only signed up for a few months. At the longest, they signed up for 3 years. So there's a general feeling that this isn't going to go on and on and on. And they were very much surprised when it did. The Southern Army gets built around Richmond. That becomes known as the Army of Northern Virginia. And they go off and attack each other just west of Washington, D.C. People were so naive that politicians and newspaper writers and just rich people from Washington, D.C. went out to the battlefield and treated it like a big picnic to see how the Civil War turned out in one day. The first battle, a lot of these battles have two different names. The Northerners call it one thing, the Southerners call it something else. So the first one is known as either the Battle of Manassas or Bull Run. And this is basically two fairly disorganized armies just running into each other. And the Southerners eventually win the battle. And the Northern troops literally, in many instances, throw down their guns and just turn around and run back to the city, to Washington, D.C. So that was very humiliating for the North, and a lot of newspaper reporters that are there to witness this. So there's a lot of fear and low morale and feeling that the North can't possibly win this thing right off the bat. McDowell is fired because of this catastrophe. Lincoln will fire one general after another when they don't do what he wants. Lincoln, as president, is head of all of the armies, and that says so in the Constitution. So the Army of the Potomac is now so heavily disorganized, is fairly chaotic, that Lincoln appoints a new general to head it. His name is McClellan. McClellan is an organizational genius, and that's why Lincoln put him in charge. McClellan is good at building armies fast, training them fast, and disciplining them fast. So McClellan will build gigantic armies, 120, 150,000 soldiers. And he can do so relatively quickly to make this army into a giant fighting force. So McClellan views himself as kind of like a Washington of his time, the savior of the North, savior of the Constitution, all these kind of things. So McClellan has an ego. The problem also, though, is that McClellan will be reluctant to actually attack. He seems to have built up these armies and then loved them to the point he didn't want to risk destroying them and actually fighting. So McClellan wants to organize. He is a planner. And he has these very intricate plans for attacking. He wants to build up his supply lines and everything. So he's taking his time in preparing. And Lincoln's perspective is, you need to attack now. This war has to be ended as fast as possible. So Lincoln is always pushing McClellan to attack. McClellan is always hesitant, coming up with excuses why he can't go forward, which angers Lincoln. McClellan is also a Democrat, does not believe in Lincoln, and doesn't like taking orders from a Republican president or a Republican Congress. So there's that political party kind of split. McClellan also does not want to fight this war to end slavery. He's willing to fight it to defend the Constitution, to preserve the Union, but when the Emancipation Proclamation is announced, McClellan will be an outspoken critic of Lincoln and will say that fighting the war to free slaves will destroy the whole country. So McClellan is useful when you need to rebuild the army quickly, but he's very controversial. And Lincoln will fire him and rehire him and then fire him and go back and forth several times. In the long term, the Army of Northern Virginia, based around Richmond, will be commanded by a general named Lee. Lee was a general going into the war. He was not the head general, though. The major general around Richmond is actually wounded in the first few battles, and Lee kind of takes over and starts winning battles. So Lee is basically in command of that army for the rest of its existence. So these are two of the major figures we're going to keep talking about over and over again as we analyze the battles and the politics that result. So questions about either of these two guys. So Lee sticks around for the duration. McClellan is in and out, and we're going to go through so many different generals. You don't have to remember all their names, though. Okay. McClellan is appointed to take over the Army of the Army of the Potomac, and he develops a pretty intricate battle plan to take Richmond. The original Southern general named Johnston is basically sitting north of Richmond waiting for the next invasion. McClellan's plan, though, is not to launch another land-based invasion to just knock the Southern Army out of the way and then take Richmond. McClellan's plan is to instead put his soldiers on a whole bunch of boats and sneak them down southeast of Yorktown or southeast of Richmond and land and disembark, which means get off the boats and go onto the lands at the old place called Yorktown. This was intended to be a surprise attack. The problem is that when you try to move 120,000 people, it takes time and it's big and loud. And Southerners had spies all over the place. So they knew what McClellan was doing. They watched him get off the boats at Yorktown. McClellan's mistake is that getting off the boats takes way too long. So by the time he launches his attack against Richmond, there is a big battle called Seven Pines just east of Richmond. Lee has the time to pick out the best defensive ground, and the Southerners win the battle again. McClellan's forces have to retreat. They go back to their boats at Yorktown. They go back up to Washington, D.C. McClellan is humiliated. And I believe McClellan is even fired at that point, if I remember correctly. So Lincoln gets rid of McClellan because it was a catastrophe. At this point, the Southerners decide to attack. They try to get their way up to Washington, D.C., and you get another battle at Bull Run, which, again, this one is pretty indecisive. The Southerners are kind of pushed westward instead. So they decide to continue trying to get around the Northern troops, what we call flanking, which means get behind your enemy, go faster than them, get around their side. The Northern Army, the Southern Army is moving north, trying to get around to get to Washington, D.C. The Northern Army just kind of stays between them and Washington, and they just kind of turn right, they pivot, they turn to face northward. And McClellan is brought back to rebuild the army, so he becomes the head general again in the north. And his orders are to push the Southern Army out of their invasion of Maryland. And they eventually, you can see up on the map up at the top, they have a battle at a place called Antietam, or in the South they call it the Battle of Sharpsburg. And this is really one of the first gigantic battles of the war itself. This happens in late 1862, so we're skipping ahead pretty fast. And Antietam turns into a bloodbath. This is what the fight of the battle actually looked like. McClellan's battle plan, he's going to attack, is basically to attack in 3 different sectors pretty much all at the same time. And whichever one breaks through the Southern defense, he wants to send reinforcements into what we call in military terms exploit the breach, which means if you divide your enemy, throw all your reinforcements into that sector, and you can run right through the enemy and destroy them. The problem is that McClellan assumed that Lee had something like twice as many troops as Lee actually had. McClellan, for some reason, thinks Lee has an equal force to the Northern Army, which is not true. So even when a breach is made, especially in the center, and a little bit in the northern sector, McClellan doesn't send in the reinforcements because he's afraid of a counterattack that can destroy the whole army, the whole Northern Army. So McClellan, again, is hesitant. So this battle largely turns out to be a draw. They fight it out for, I think, 2 days, and then they just basically pull away from each other. But it is very, very bloody. It is known, even today, as the bloodiest day, the first day, as the bloodiest single day in U.S. history. There are 7,000 soldiers killed in this one day. Which is more than the D-Day invasions of Normandy in World War II. It is more than the War of 1812 and the War with Mexico combined. Those 2 entire wars saw less casualties than one day at Antietam. It is an absolute bloodbath. And this shocked the northern population. And it shocked the southern population. This is just horrific stuff. And it happened, I believe it was October, so right when the weather started to cool down in that region, and cool down in a big way. So you get big fogs in the morning, and the battle started in the morning. So they literally fought through the fog, and once the gun smoke goes off, all the gun smoke mixes with the fog, and the soldiers talked and wrote about the fog of Antietam. they eventually end up fighting an enemy that they couldn't even see. And when they start to retreat, they can't really go get all the wounded and dying soldiers out there in the field. So when night falls, they can hear all these screams of all these wounded and dying people just out there that couldn't be retrieved. And it was just absolutely horrific. And this is where a whole lot of both sides, the North and the South, came to realize that this war was going to be long and it was going to be unimaginably horrible. The Civil War would eventually kill 2% of the American population. 600,000 soldiers on both sides combined, which was absolutely horrific. Does anyone know how many soldiers that would kill if 2% of the American population today was wiped out all of a sudden? 6 million. So this is bad beyond belief. And if anyone remembers how bad the occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan were at their worst in 2004, 2005, imagine that times 100, literally. And that's where you get the Civil War. So the Civil War will eventually reach the lives of every single person living in the country virtually. 2% of the population gone. Every single person has a family member or a friend who had been killed in the war. This touches people emotionally on a very deep level, and they remember this for the rest of their lives. And obviously for the guys fighting, those who survive never forget it as the kind of biggest point of reference for their entire lives. Antietam was a draw, and everybody knows it. Military historians, and pretty much everyone even admitted it back then. But it's also the closest that the North had actually come to winning a battle by this point. The South is really kicking the Northern Army's butt all across the area between Washington and Richmond. The South had won all the battles up to that point. So Lincoln, we now know, was planning some kind of announcement about emancipation, the ending of slavery. He wanted to do it when he got into office. But he doesn't want to make the announcement after a Northern loss, because that makes him look desperate and weak, right? So he held back. He waited and waited and waited for some kind of Northern victory on the battlefield to announce it. And there's a lot of debate within the Minnesota cabinet about whether or not should be doing this, and the Republican Party in general. But he announces the Emancipation Proclamation in the aftermath of Antietam, because that's the closest that the North had to a big victory in the area, in what we call the Eastern War. And the Emancipation Proclamation is basically an offer. And when you read it, if you read it very closely, you notice that he only makes the offer to states that are in rebellion against the authority of the federal government. So for the states that have joined the Confederacy and are rebels, his offer is, your slaves will be free. If your state rejoins the United States by January 1st, so the beginning of the new year, 1863, those southern slave owners who are losing their labor supply because the slaves are freed, if you rejoin the United States, the slave owners of your states will get money. They'll be compensated for the loss of their labor. If you don't rejoin the country after or before New Year's Day, then your slaves are free and you get nothing. So Lincoln says, under the war powers that he had gained because of this rebellion, he says, slaves in any rebellious state are going to be free. And he holds out a motivation to the southern states. If you rejoin, we'll give your people some money for each individual slave that they lost. Question arises immediately, what about the border states that hadn't voted about whether or not to join? They have slaves. They're not in rebellion theoretically, so what about them? That one is really pushed aside. Do any southern states take him up on this offer? No. Why not? Any guesses?
Money, maybe? They didn't offer enough money.
Well, that's part of it. Everyone has their price, and he didn't really announce exactly what the price was, but it's generally assumed it's not going to be a whole lot.
They think they're going to win?
Yeah, they're winning on the battlefield. So why sell themselves short? If they just keep winning the battles, they don't have to accept the end of slavery at all. Just keep winning. So if you're winning the war, why would you give in to this kind of offer? And that's exactly what the Southern perspective was. So no states rejoin, and on November 1st, theoretically, all slaves are freed. The long-term effects. Lincoln shows himself willing again to use the power that the president accumulates in times of national emergency. And he talked about that publicly and with his cabinet, that many of the things he was doing, including emancipation, were the result of his powers that grew during the war. So that opened the obvious question: what happens when the war ends? Do the states automatically revert back to their state laws that had slavery still, now that the war is over and the president's power is, dissipated? His war powers are gone. What happens to the Emancipation Proclamation? So that's a major cause of concern, especially for Lincoln and the Republicans going forward, and that's what eventually motivates them to form a constitutional amendment to eradicate slavery in the whole country forever. And again, that's something that's very well depicted in the new movie on Lincoln. There's a very good scene where he's going through the legal analysis of his war powers that created emancipation, what happens when the war ends, and just how confusing legally that could become.
Is that movie in theaters already?
Yeah, it came out, a couple weeks ago or so.
Is it good?
Oh yeah, it's one of the best historical movies I think I've probably ever seen. Very accurate. Based on several different major scholarly studies on Lincoln. Or Lincoln as president, put it that way. And it did really well to, I think, capture the kind of personal sadness of Lincoln. I mean, Lincoln understood that this war was his choice, right? He could have chose to end the war any given day. And when he gets the reports of all these casualties coming in, he knows that these are the human cost of his decision. And he was very, down. He was very sad and talked about suicide very openly. And there are reports that he used to carry on like a shaving razor or something, and that his cabinet eventually had that taken away from him because they're afraid he's going to cut his wrist as president in the White House because he couldn't deal with the depression. He is a very, very sad figure. And if you ever see pictures of him before he is president, he looks fairly young and healthy. Toward the end, he is just, you can see it on his face, just beaten down by these responsibilities and the kind of emotional results of them. And he had a child die in the White House, and his wife was driving him nuts, on and on and on. So there's no end to it. And in his own lifetime, he was a hated person, even amongst the northern population. But we'll get into the details of that also. Another problem of the Emancipation Proclamation largely is what happens to the border state slaves. Those that are in, say, Kentucky or Maryland or Delaware, or any other kind of those states that are theoretically still in the North because they haven't rebelled yet, but were largely not rebelling because Lincoln just threw their people into jail. A lot of the northern states had already made slavery illegal, so that wasn't much of a question. But the official statement is that any slave in any state in rebellion is now theoretically freed. But the question of slaves in, say, Kentucky or like Missouri or something like that, that is never really answered. So that's a long-term problem. The slaves that are in the South aren't always exactly aware of the emancipation announcement because slave owners aren't going to tell them. They're not going to read in Southern newspapers. If they could read, I mean, a lot of these slaves are captive, oppressed, and never allowed to learn to read or do any kind of advanced mathematics. And even those who did somehow hear of the Emancipation Proclamation, that did not make them free because they didn't have the real world resources to make themselves free. The slave owners still had guns, and if you tried to proclaim your freedom, you could be beaten or killed. So the real practical, kind of on-the-ground reality of freedom does not reach a lot of the southern slaves until the U.S. Army invades their area and literally runs off the slave owners from the plantation. And many, many, many slaves first hear of their freedom when a northern sergeant reads it to them, when the Northern Army has conquered their town or their state or their kind of region or whatever. That's the first experience they have of real freedom. And that could take years. And in a lot of areas, that doesn't happen until 1865. So the announcement is made fairly early on, but it's an ongoing process of actually freeing these people. Another big result for the Emancipation Proclamation, if you read it, is also that Lincoln, in the same proclamation, said that now that these people are free, they're going to become citizens protected by law. They also have the freedom to join the U.S. Army. And a lot of black people were very willing to join the U.S. Army to go kill some southern white people. They loved that idea. And they also loved the idea of proving to even northern white racists that blacks can learn, they can fight, they're not naturally inferior to the white race. Or what people claim is some kind of different white race. And eventually, somewhere between 180 and 200,000 black troops volunteered for the U.S. Army at a time when the Southern Army at its height would maybe be 180,000. So the addition of all these black troops will allow the northern armies to vastly outnumber the South, what troops the South could mobilize. And they fight, the black troops fight very bravely. They fight to the death because they understand what would happen to them if they were captured by the Southerners. Oftentimes when Southerners captured black troop companies that are entirely black, they'll just execute them all. They don't take prisoners. They just kill everyone.
Were they still mistreated even in the Army?
Yes, because a lot of even the U.S. Army leaders are also racist. So in the beginning, when the black troops start to join, they're not sent to the front lines to fight, because a lot of the white racists, even in the Army, didn't trust them to fight very effectively. So they're sent off to dig ditches and move wagons and supplies along, that kind of menial labor, physical labor. That a lot of the white racists said, that's what they're used to, that's all they can actually do. So it was a big political move by Lincoln and several senators and even a few colonels and generals to take those black troop companies and move them to the front lines and give them the opportunity to fight. And when they were allowed to fight, they fought very, very bravely.
Did they get wages?
At first, not equal wages to white soldiers. And then they complained about it, and eventually it's not ever completely resolved. It is in certain small instances. And a lot of this stuff there's a movie called Glory that's based on the black volunteers. And it ends with their first experience fighting, and that first black troop company was wiped out. They're virtually all killed. And of course, in the end, this adds the cause of freedom, liberty, and eventually even equality, racial equality, to the cause of the Northern War. They're not just fighting to defend the Constitution, to defend the Union, to bring the Southern states back in. They're going to fight from 1863, especially going forward, to free slaves. And that is very controversial in the North. So Lincoln has to deal with a lot of Republicans who disagreed with how he was running the war, even with his own cabinet, who said that he was moving too slow. And then when he announces emancipation, he gets a whole other portion of the northern population that say, now you're going too fast. Right? So Lincoln has a lot of different factions that he has to balance, and convinced that his decisions are right and just, and that you have to stick with him or else the whole thing's going to lose. And virtually every northern politician and newspaper writer and reporter at some point seemed to question whether the U.S. should continue the war, whether it was worth it or not. And Lincoln is just about the only politician who says, yes, absolutely, we will fight to the bitter end. We will never give up. And he was very different and put himself out on a limb from the rest of the country. And it seems like almost everybody else questioned at some time if this was worth it, if it should continue. And Lincoln never allowed those questions. Even if they entered his own mind, he never stated them publicly. He never wrote about them. He said, yes, we will win. It's just a matter of time. And it may take eventually, 500,000 lives to get the victory. But he says it will be worth it. And the U.S. will never give up. So questions about any of these at all? Okay, so that's the war, in the so-called Eastern War around Washington, D.C. and Richmond, going into early 1863. There's a whole other side of the war that is often forgotten and not very much taught in textbooks and history classes in general, and this is what has become known as the Western War, basically the war for the Mississippi River. And that war went very differently. It is still a northern invasion looking to conquer land, strategic land, and to force the Southerners to give up. But it is largely very successful for the North in a fairly short amount of time. So they start building up the U.S. Navy to implement this blockade, and the U.S. Navy will invade New Orleans and fairly quickly conquer New Orleans. So New Orleans and a lot of southern Louisiana is occupied territory for a whole lot of the war, and that brings a whole another set of questions. Emancipating slaves, what kind of laws are going to be rebuilt in Louisiana, on and on and on. So that's a whole other side of this war that we're going to have to skip past pretty quickly. But the U.S. conquers New Orleans and starts moving up the Mississippi River from the south. The giant fort of the whole river is at Vicksburg. That is an absolute fortress that is very difficult to take. So the invasion from the southern part takes New Orleans, but has a very difficult time really gaining much ground into the rest of Louisiana. So much of the rest of the invasion comes to be from Illinois pushing southward along the river. And this will largely, a guy named Ulysses Grant will be put in charge of that invasion process. He is from the west. He had been a member of the army before, and he's basically promoted to general and given orders from Lincoln to conquer the Mississippi. The Southerners realize that this is going on, so they build a series of forts. Vicksburg is kind of rebuilt among them. There are two forts that they even build along the Tennessee River, Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, to try to defend the whole kind of northern part of Tennessee, the border of Kentucky, and also the kind of crossing point toward the Mississippi. And the Southerners and Grant realize very quickly that those are strongholds, and so you get a series of battles that are fought over them. I think it's Fort Henry that falls in one day fairly quickly. Donelson takes several attacks. And Grant attacks once, is defeated. Attacks again, is defeated. Attacks again. I think it's the fourth time attacking Donelson that they actually win. The Northerners actually win. And this reveals something about Grant right off the bat. Even when he loses, he will keep attacking. So Grant will basically become like the anti-McClellan. He doesn't have to be told to attack. He just does. He knows he has a bigger army. He knows it's stronger. And he sees it as just a matter of time, if you just keep on hitting the enemy, that they will eventually give up. So that eventually works with Donelson. And Grant starts moving his forces down the Tennessee River, looking to maybe start the invasion of northern Alabama, and runs into a southern army at a place near Shiloh Church. And you get another, really one of the biggest gigantic battles of the Mississippi campaign. And this is known as the Battle of Shiloh, which is basically Grant's forces are moving south. They encamp one night. They don't know really that the Southern Army is very close. And the Southern Army just kind of runs into them. So the Southerners attack in the beginning of the first day of the battle. And it's very chaotic. It's just kind of out there in the woods. There doesn't seem to be a very powerful battle plan on either side. So really the Southerners just kind of launch an invasion, launch an attack. The Northerners are caught off guard because they're just attacked. They didn't even know that the enemy was around. So they retreat by the end of day one. They give up some land, and then Grant orders a very surprising counterattack on day two, which destroys the southern lines, and the Southerners are forced to retreat back down basically to Alabama. And from that point on, Grant will continue moving forward. So Grant again shows that he doesn't take losses. I mean, he may lose on the battlefield, but he keeps attacking the enemy because he has more soldiers, he has more weapons, he has more guns, basically. And time and time again, that will prove successful, but at a very tragic human cost. So Shiloh is basically like the Antietam of the West. It's another horrific battle with huge amounts of casualties. Not so many as Antietam, but it's another example of basically a bloodbath, and something that's shocking to the American population. That's a famous painting of what the battle looked like. You see it's, again, very chaotic. It's just kind of out there in the woods. They call it the Battle of Shiloh because there's a church called Shiloh Church that's just kind of in the vicinity. So it's really out there in almost the middle of nowhere. And Grant, from there, basically abandons the Tennessee River and then goes back to the Mississippi and starts moving south as fast as possible. Grant looks at the map of the fort at Vicksburg and realizes that Vicksburg is almost impossible to attack. It is literally a fortress. It's built at one of the major bends in the Mississippi, and it's built up on cliffs, so it's almost impossible to run straight uphill while the enemy is shooting down at you. And because it's built at a bend in the river, the Southern troops occupying the fort can look upriver very far, and they can tell when the Northern troops are coming so they can prepare themselves. I mean, it is just an absolute fortress, and it's almost impenetrable. So even Grant, the kind of over-aggressive General Grant, will not attack this fort directly. Grant's plan instead is to go around Vicksburg, continue down the river until he gets to a good crossing point, and then get his troops. He basically will just try to surround the fort at Vicksburg and starve the Southerners into surrender. The problem with this kind of warfare is called laying siege, which literally means surrounding the enemy and just waiting for them to either starve or give up. Don't let any supplies in or out. The problem with those kinds of siege tactics, just basically encamping yourself around the enemy, is what if another enemy army comes up and attacks you from behind? Now you're trapped between two forces shooting at you. So Grant's long-term plan is to eliminate that possibility of another Southern army coming up from behind. So he decides to first attack the city of Jackson, which is really a giant railroad intersection and a big piece of the supply chain on the way to Vicksburg. Jackson is tough to take. It's defended by another Southern army. It takes something like 6 assaults on the city. Again, Grant attacks, he loses, attacks again and again and again and again, until he finally gets Jackson, dominates the city, and ensures that there will be no Southern army that will be able to attack him from behind. And then he finally brings his troops further west and surrounds the fort at Vicksburg. The siege of Vicksburg begins in early May, I think somewhere around May 10th, 1863, and it goes on for a couple months. So very slowly, the food supplies and the medicine in the fort start to wear out. The soldiers start going hungry. They refuse to give in. They do not surrender the fort to Grant until July 4th, 1863, Independence Day. And that's a very important date in the overall war, because Vicksburg, a lot of military historians say, is one of the giant turning points of the war. When the Northerners take Vicksburg, they basically occupy the whole Mississippi. They separate those western states, Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, from the rest of the Confederacy, and they implement their naval blockade even along the river to destroy any kind of Southern resupply from the rest of the world. So the naval blockade goes into massive effect by mid-1863 and will very slowly just basically strangle the South into submission on that level. And Vicksburg was the key to it, a lot of military historians say. So Vicksburg is often forgotten in the kind of horrible fame that the other eastern battles like Gettysburg eventually kind of take hold in the American mind. But it's just as important for the long term.